of women taken, of giants born. But the Bible never tells us who were the wives of the Nephilim giants. The Nephilim walked in strength, yet their partners are erased, their names cut from the record, their faces lost in silence. Was this omission or suppression? Stay with me until the end, because the truth about the wives of the giants was buried for a reason, and once you see it, you'll never read Genesis the same way again. The mystery begins in Genesis 6, where the text whispers of a union that should never have been. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives, any they chose. From this forbidden mingling came the Nephilim, a Hebrew word meaning fallen ones, giants who towered above the earth in the days before the flood. Their presence is recorded in a single chilling verse, but the story we expect next is missing. The text names the giants, yet tells us nothing of their wives. If Nephilim walked the earth, who walked beside them at night? Why does the record fall silent at the very point where the mystery deepens? Already we sense a deliberate omission. Genesis gives us the fathers, the sons, even the violence they spread. But the women who bore their children, the wives who lived in the shadow of these beings, are absent. The silence is not incidental. It is like smudged ink across a parchment, a line scraped away by a careful hand. We were meant to know the giants existed, but perhaps not the ones who kept their line alive. The early church wrestled with the same absence. The New Testament alludes to it in whispers. Jude 6 speaks of angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper dwelling, chained in eternal darkness for their rebellion. 2 Peter 2 confirms the same, binding them in gloomy pits until judgment. These verses confirm the transgression of heaven and earth, yet they too pass over the wives in silence. The men of renown are remembered, but the women are erased. Why? Consider how strange this would have felt to the first listeners. Ancient Israel knew the rhythm of genealogies well. Adam's line, Noah's line, Abraham's line. Wives are rarely central, but they are not entirely absent. Sarah is named, Rebecca is named, Leah and Rachel are named. Even foreign wives, like Ruth the Moabite, find their way into the sacred record. Yet, when it comes to the Nephilim, the most infamous figures before the flood, no woman is named, no mother is remembered. It is as though an entire generation of women walked the earth in shadow, their voices muffled, their stories erased. This silence becomes even more suspicious when we look across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh, part god, part man, is given a lineage, his mother named as the goddess Ninsun. In Greek tradition, the giants have mothers and daughters, titanesses, who war alongside them. Norse myth preserves Jotnar women, giantesses who wed gods and bore monstrous children. Every culture preserves the wives of its giants, except Israel. What does it mean that Scripture alone withholds them? Could their absence be intentional, cut from the record, because their presence raised questions too dangerous to preserve? Imagine hearing this mystery read aloud in a dim gathering of believers. An oil lamp flickering against the wall. The words speak of giants, of angels bound, of a flood that swept the earth, and yet never once do they mention the wives who made such households possible. Would you not lean closer, wondering what names have been erased? Would you not ask in a whisper, what happened to them? The omission itself begins to teach. It is not merely what we read, but what we cannot read that shapes our understanding. Some ancient voices tried to fill the gap. Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, insists the Nephilim were offspring of the union between angels and women, a race of great strength who filled the earth with violence. Philo of Alexandria called them souls carried away by pride. Rabbinic traditions speak of the Watchers descending on Mount Hermon to bind themselves by oath, taking wives and corrupting the earth. Later, speculative works like the Book of Enoch expanded on this tale. naming the chiefs of the angels and describing in detail their forbidden unions. Whether historical memory or theological imagination, these voices testify that the silence of Scripture was felt deeply, and attempts to fill it multiplied in the margins of history. Some of those words survived only in fragments, hidden in smoke-stained manuscripts, or copied into Ethiopian codices while vanishing elsewhere. Again the pattern. What is most mysterious is most at risk of erasure. And so we are left with a silence that is not empty but heavy, like a sealed door in a ruined temple. The giants are mentioned, their deeds condemned, their fathers chained in darkness. But of their wives we hear nothing. Were they human women, swallowed by legend? Were they themselves giantesses, remembered in other cultures but cut away from Israel's story? Or is their absence meant to signal something deeper? So, if Nephilim walked the earth, who walked beside them? The question lingers like incense smoke after prayer, curling upward but never answered. And perhaps that is deliberate. Perhaps we are being taught that some knowledge is veiled, some mystery is too dark to name aloud. Yet the silence itself will guide our search. For in the next layer of this investigation, we will see how absence can be its own evidence, how women may have been present and erased, their names cut from the record like words scraped off a wax tablet. If the giants truly had wives, then somewhere in the margins of history their shadows remain, and to find them we must press deeper into what the world chose to forget. But before we continue, hit the subscribe button and like the video for more timeless Bible tales. Now, the wives of the giants are missing. Open the scrolls, trace the genealogies, and you will find fathers and sons, battles and kingdoms, but not the women who bore half-divine children. The silence is not neutral. It is shaped, it is chosen. It is a wound in the text itself. We were never meant to pass over it without asking why. Why does Scripture name the Nephilim yet erase their companions? Why do the giants stride across the story, yet their households vanish like smoke? This silence feels heavier than absence, almost as if the ink was scraped from the page. Consider how patriarchal records in the ancient Near East already treated women. Wives are rarely mentioned unless they alter destiny. Sarah, Rebecca, Ruth. Even in ordinary genealogies, women fall into shadow while men anchor the line. If normal families erased wives, how much more disturbing would it be to preserve the names of monstrous unions? Can you see it? A line of towering men remembered for terror, but the women beside them swallowed by scribal silence. You and I might ask, what kind of fear requires not just omission, but erasure? Why do all other traditions give giants their women, while the Bible does not? Does this absence reveal something holy, or something hidden? One can almost imagine a scribe hunched over parchment, choosing silence instead of scandal, allowing memory of giant women to fall into the vault of smoke-stained margins. Origen, one of the early Christian fathers, mused uneasily on Genesis 6. He spoke of angels who fell, and women who bore strange offspring, but he did not ask about the women beyond their role as vessels. Augustine recoiled from the idea altogether, preferring allegory to scandal. The wives of giants were too much, too close to blasphemy. Better, perhaps, to bury them under allegory, to treat them as symbols rather than mothers. Do you feel the tension here? We are left with an image of women once living, breathing, fearing, and yet cut out of the record until they exist only as a ghostly absence. Imagine, for a moment, the unwritten story, a woman standing in shadow beside a towering husband, half proud, half terrified. Did she whisper to her children by night, knowing the flood was coming? Did she watch armies tremble at her household, or did she live in shame of what her womb had borne? We will never know, because the record does not let us. But is that not itself the revelation? The absence forces us to wrestle with what was too dangerous to name. The scribal world gave us palimpsests, parchments scraped and rewritten until only faint ghost letters remained beneath the new text. What if the wives of giants suffered the same fate? not destroyed, but covered over, not forgotten, but hidden under layers of silence. The physical image lingers, cracked wax seals, smudged margins, stories cut from the record so completely that only their outlines haunt us. And yet, their erasure leaves a louder echo than their names would have, for every culture gave giants their women. Only here do we find the giants alone, and that silence itself becomes a clue. If wives were erased, was it simply cultural, or did it conceal something stranger? Perhaps their presence was too unnatural to name, their role too impossible to preserve. Imagine if the giants had partners, but those unions could not last, could not carry seed, could not sustain generations. What if the women beside them were remembered only as shadows because their wombs bore monsters that could not endure? The silence may not only be omission, but a trace of sterility, a reminder of unions never meant to flourish. Few dare to ask it, but we must. Because if these marriages were barren, then the mystery of the Nephilim is not just about erasure, it is about impossibility. And that is where our path must now turn. The question of sterility presses like a shadow on the silence. If the Nephilim had wives, why does the record refuse to name them? One answer rises from ancient voices. Perhaps the marriages were barren, unions that bore no lasting seed. The offspring of angels and women may have been aberrations, half-born between heaven and earth, unable to endure. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, described them as strong but doomed, unnatural in origin, and monstrous in appetite. Philo of Alexandria, another early voice, spoke of their pride as proof that they could not be part of the natural order. Even their existence, he implied, was temporary. Were their companions erased, or were their wombs too frail to carry seed beyond a single generation? The scriptures themselves seem to hint at this unease. The laws of Moses in Leviticus warn against mixing kinds, forbidding the ploughing of ox and donkey together, or the weaving of linen and wool in the same garment. The principle is clear. Creation was ordered, and disorder bore decay. Numbers 13 shows us the spies trembling before Anakim, descendants of giants. But note this, the report names clans and sons, never mothers, never wives. Deuteronomy 2 remembers the Emim and the Zamzumim. Both peoples counted as giants, yet only in terms of nations swept away, not households built. The silence becomes suspicious. We are shown warriors, not families, as though something about their reproduction was unstable, not fit to endure. Imagine the image that would have haunted an ancient scribe. A towering man of renown, a woman in his shadow, but a home filled with silence instead of children's laughter. Would you not see sterility as judgment, a curse sewn into their very design? And if so, does the silence of Scripture reflect not erasure, but impossibility? The ink may have run dry, not because the names were cut away, but because there were no names to write. Early rabbis suggested something similar. They spoke of the watchers descending with unnatural desire, but they wondered whether such unions could produce true continuity. The Book of Enoch, speculative but treasured in some communities, described the Nephilim as consuming the earth in violence, but offered no legacy of stable families. Instead, their children were said to turn upon one another, devouring themselves into extinction. Can you hear it? Even in speculation, their line ends in barrenness and blood. Yet what is most haunting is the way silence itself acts like erasure. We find no names of wives, no households, no matriarchs in their line. It is as if the parchment bears faint scars, like lines scraped with a knife and overwritten. In monasteries, scribes once erased with pumice, leaving ghost letters beneath the new ink. What if the wives of giants linger like those ghost letters, present only an absence? Haunting but never legible, the wax cracks, the ink smudges, and the story is swallowed. But the silence does not settle the matter, it sharpens it. If sterility was their curse, then how do we explain their reappearance after the flood? The Anakim, the Rephaim, the towering figures the Israelites feared in Canaan, all echo the Nephilim. If sterility closed the womb of their wives, then who gave birth to their heirs? Do you feel the tension? The sterility theory answers one question, only to force another. Perhaps that is why the scripture remains deliberately silent. It hints at impossibility, but does not speak it outright. The wives of the Nephilim may have lived, but their stories were barren, their memory scraped from the record, like wax from a tablet. And yet, if sterility was their fate, then the mystery only deepens. How did giants walk again in the land after waters receded? The flood came as judgment, wiping clean a world corrupted by violence, and yet the giants returned. Numbers 13 records the spies trembling before the Anakim, descendants of the Nephilim, saying, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Here is the haunting question. How could they be back if every breath of life outside the ark had perished? The text does not answer, but its silence forces us to confront what has been buried. Were the giants restored, remembered, or reborn? And more pressingly, if they had wives before, did they have wives again? The names of these clans echo like thunder through Israel's story. The Anakim, whose stature made armies falter. The Rephaim, whose very name in Hebrew hints at shades, or the dead. The Emim, dreaded by Moab. Each of these peoples is described as vast in size, as if fragments of the Nephilim bloodline had endured. Yet the same silence persists. No mothers are named, no wives appear, no households recorded. The text gives the terror, but never the intimacy. Could this omission be coincidence? Or was it scraped deliberately from the record? You can almost see the ink rubbed thin by centuries, erasing the women who once stood beside giants. Pause on this. Other cultures loved to name giant mothers. Greek tales speak of Gaia birthing titans, Norse sagas of Jotnar women shaping kings, Mesopotamian epics of goddesses who bore half-divine heroes. But Israel leaves the giants as fatherless, motherless, wifeless. This is not silence by accident. This is silence that feels chosen. Could it be that the wives of giants were buried beneath stone monastery floors, their memory sealed as though too dangerous for later readers? This absence gnaws at us, because survival demands continuity. If giants appeared again after the flood, someone bore them. The unanswered question itself becomes the evidence. What if the return of giants is the very proof that something has been cut away? Not destroyed, but concealed. Not forgotten, but hidden, like ghostwriting beneath scraped parchment. Deuteronomy 2 recalls how nations trembled at these beings. The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. The Israelites walking toward Canaan would have carried whispers of them like a weight on the back. Imagine a child in the camp listening to older men mutter about shadows as tall as cedars, families of giants waiting across the Jordan. The stories would spread like smoke, and yet never a word of the women who birthed them. The households are cut off mid-sentence, like lines scratched out of a Bronze Age tablet before it reached the copyist, and the silence sharpens the dread. Because what does it mean if wives existed but were scrubbed from history? Did scribes fear that naming them would lend permanence to unions God judged unholy? Or is the very absence meant to hint that these households were unnatural, that their continuity broke the order of creation? Perhaps the silence is not blank, but coded. A warning disguised as erasure. Speculative traditions, like the Book of Jubilees, try to explain the return. They claim the sin of the Watchers echoed even after the flood, that their rebellion left lingering spirits who stirred new corruption. This is speculation, not scripture, but it testifies that ancient readers struggled with the same impossibility. Giants after judgment. To explain it, they imagined repetition, a second trespass, or perhaps women whose names were buried so deep they live only as shadows in forgotten texts. What if that burial was deliberate? What if every scroll that mentioned wives of the Rephaim was pulled from circulation, hidden in smoke-stained margins, sealed behind wax until no copy survived? It would explain the void. It would explain why Israel alone preserves the terror, but never the households. And it would remind us, silence itself can be a kind of testimony, shaped by hands that chose what we are allowed to remember. If Nephilim walked the earth, who walked beside them? The persistence of giants after the flood makes the question unavoidable. Someone must have stood at their side, and yet those figures are absent, as if deliberately excised. The silence becomes its own voice, whispering through the missing lines that some knowledge was never meant for open scrolls. The giants do not vanish all at once. Their shadow stretches across Israel's story, fading only as covenant faith takes root. Genesis 14 gives us one of the earliest glimpses after the flood, when Abraham joins a coalition of kings to rescue Lot. Hidden in the text is a line many readers pass over. The Rephaim were there, an ancient people already known for size and terror. These names scatter like broken bones through Scripture, a trail of dread lingering at the edges of the Promised Land. Yet, as time unfolds, the giants diminish. By the time Israel enters Canaan, their power is already waning. Deuteronomy recalls how the Emim and Zamzummim, once vast and terrifying, were displaced. The text whispers that their time was already running out. Can you feel the shift? The giants who once filled the world with violence are now spoken of in past tense, echoes of a race unravelling. And then comes the most famous figure of them all, a giant who does not stand as a faceless name in a genealogy, but as a man clothed in bronze, bellowing across a valley. 1 Samuel 17 tells the story with cinematic weight. Goliath of Gath, 6 cubits and a span in height, his armour gleaming like scales, his spear shaft as thick as a weaver's beam. He taunts Israel for 40 days, morning and evening, his voice thundering in the ears of soldiers who cower rather than face him. Here the dread of giants is made flesh again, not as a legend, not as a memory, but as a living terror. He is not simply an opponent on a battlefield, he is the last roaring echo of an age God is putting to rest. And standing before him comes David, a shepherd boy, small enough that Saul's own armour drowns him. The contrast could not be sharper. A youth with no sword, no shield, only a sling and 5 stones. Now pause and feel the tension. All the fear of generations hangs on this moment. The giants have been fading, but here is one more, towering in defiance. Imagine the Israelite soldiers in their tents, whispering of the Emim, of the Anakim, of every story told around the fire. Imagine them watching as a boy walks out into the valley, the sun glinting off the giant's armour, the dust rising with each of his steps. Goliath laughs, mocking him, mocking Israel, mocking the living God. This is not just a duel, it is the last stand of the giants against the covenant. And what happens? A single stone flies. A forehead is struck. The giant falls face first into the dust. The shepherd runs forward, seizes the enemy's own sword, and cuts off his head. The valley trembles with the shout of Israel's army. Do you see it? The entire age of giants collapses in that one moment. Their defiance is silenced, not by greater strength, not by another towering figure, but by faith in the name of the Lord. That is the secret hidden in the story. The giants were always doomed, because faith unseats what flesh exalts. But do not think this is only triumphal. The text is not careless with its detail. It tells us that Goliath had brothers, other giants from Gath. 2 Samuel 21 remembers them. Men with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. Freakish signs of a corrupted lineage. They too are struck down by David's men. Slowly, methodically, the last fragments of the giant clans fall. The giants are not destroyed in a single blow, but their line crumbles until nothing remains but memory. The decline is gradual, but unmistakable. What does it mean that the most terrifying enemies of God's people are not removed at once, but fall piece by piece, one by one, until the shadow is gone? Does that not feel like a message to us? Think of the pattern. From Genesis to Joshua to Samuel, the giants diminish as faith rises. The sons of Anak are driven out. The Rephaim fade from the land. Goliath falls to a boy's stone. Even the monsters with 12 fingers and 12 toes are not spared. Scripture paints a picture of decline, not because Israel grew stronger, but because God's covenant outlasts every terror. And yet, in all of this, the wives of the giants are still absent. No grieving widow is named for Goliath. No mother is remembered for the Anakim. The giants die, but their households are silent. The silence remains part of the story, a testimony to what was cut away. But the theological weight is clear. The silence of the wives frames the triumph of God's people. The giants lived large in memory, but their households left no legacy. They leave no future. The giants fall, and the covenant moves forward. Can you see how this pattern speaks beyond history? Whatever towers against the people of God, whatever looms like a giant in the valley, it cannot stand forever. The wives are not remembered because their children do not endure. And the lesson resounds: giants fall, but faith remains. Now the path of our investigation bends again. We have followed the giants through their rise, their mystery, their erasure, their survival, and their decline. But were they ever only about flesh and blood? Or do they endure as symbols, carried in myth and memory, reminders of powers that still haunt us in other forms? The wives of the giants vanish from the text, yet shadows of them linger in ways deeper than genealogy. When scripture falls silent, imagination fills the void, and what arises are not names but archetypes, shapes of fear and longing, too dangerous to write plainly. Can you sense it? The women erased from the record begin to echo in patterns that move through human story, not individuals, but embodiments of chaos and overwhelming power. If Nephilim walked the earth, who walked beside them? In scripture, dangerous women often appear not as historical figures, but as symbols. Lady Folly in Proverbs sits at the crossroads, her voice seductive yet deadly, leading the simple to Sheol. Babylon in Revelation is not just a city, but a woman adorned in scarlet, drunk with the blood of saints. Jezebel in Kings is both queen and archetype, a living emblem of idolatry and seduction. Notice the pattern. Whenever the feminine is erased in ordinary records, it re-emerges in prophetic imagination as symbol, carrying the weight of desire and destruction together. Could this be the afterlife of the wives of giants? Not named, not remembered in the genealogies, but transformed into shadows of the feminine untamed, terrifying to the scribes, lingering in archetype. Their silence may itself be a survival, a palimpsest of archetype where their absence becomes presence in another form. And you, listening now, must ask, what is more powerful, to be written as a name, or to survive as a symbol? Perhaps the wives of the giants endure in the very images that haunted Israel's imagination of corruption, the whispering seductress, the foreign queen, the city adorned like a bride of destruction. Pause with me. What do these archetypes teach us? They are not just about women, but about the human heart's fear of forces it cannot control. The wives of the giants become less about gender and more about power itself. Fertility turned monstrous. Intimacy with the divine turned into chaos. The household itself destabilized by unions never meant to be. Their erasure from the record did not erase the fear, it only pressed it deeper, so that it resurfaces in symbol again and again, from Lady Folly to Babylon. And is that not how archetypes work? They survive suppression. Smudged ink may hide a name, but the shadow of that figure lives on in dream, in poetry, in nightmare. The wives of the giants may have been cut from the page, but they rise again as images of destruction and corruption, archetypes that no flood could wash away. The physical record silenced them, but the human imagination remembered them in the only way it could, as symbols that warn and terrify. So we come to this unsettling thought: perhaps the wives of the giants never vanished. Perhaps they live on as archetypes, haunting symbols that Scripture itself recycles whenever it warns us of corruption, dressed in beauty, destruction, veiled in intimacy. Their presence was too disruptive to name, yet too potent to forget. If Nephilim walked the earth, their wives may still walk beside us, not in flesh, but in symbol, in the archetypes that whisper through every age. If the wives of the giants